Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. This is a special edition podcast focused on the coronavirus COVID-19 and the outbreak of the novel coronavirus as a business risk. Beyond the human cost to people around the world, the disruptive potential to retailers in Canada is real. At this early stage, for most, though, it can best be described as known unknowns. But for some retailers, they are feeling the early impacts, calling down sales for international locations, experiencing late shipments, missed buying trips, and perceptible decreases in Chinese tourist-oriented sales in their outlets. In this episode, I'm going to focus on the supply chain delays and cost increases. For most retailers, this is a 90-day plus issue. The goods on offer, made or sourced in China right now and in spring are at retail are already on the water and warehouse domestically. Continued delays, however, mean bottlenecks, shipping ports, or air freight, both of which mean more delays and cost, including promotional plans and long lead time marketing programs. To help us get our arms around this, I brought together three experts for this podcast. First, I welcome Frank Lavin, founder and chairman, Export Now, back to the podcast to set the stage. With decades of the most senior experience in Asia, including U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Singapore and working in the White House as an Undersecretary of Commerce for Asia, he brings a unique and rare voice to the current state of affairs. Second, Sarah Barnes-Humphrey, retail supply chain expert and host of the most excellent podcast, Let's Talk Supply Chain. Sarah helps us zone in on the retail issues and scope and scale of the issues. Lastly, Audrey Ross, logistics and customs specialist for Orchard Customer Beauty, a Canadian-based global supplier and maker of cosmetics with offices in China and with a global sourcing footprint, brings it all together and gives us a day-to-day perspective dealing with the crisis in their work supplying retailers in North America and around the world. But first, let's jump right into my conversation with Frank, live from Singapore. Frank, welcome to The Voice of Retail. How are you doing?
Michael, good to chat with you. Doing fine in Singapore, not in China this week because of the coronavirus.
No one better to speak to give us some kind of sense and background. And you know, speaking to retailers, it reminds me of that Donald Rumsfeld quote, known unknowns. But I thought perhaps you might be able to clear it up for us. And before we just dive into that, could you, for those listeners who didn't perhaps hear our interview from the Guelph, New York episode last year, give us a sense of your background and what you do and your company Export Now.
Yeah, our business, Export Now, I'm the chairman and CEO. We are a U.S. parent company with a wholly owned China subsidiary. And what we do is we launch and operate e-commerce stores in China for international brands. So we can basically take any consumer brand in the world, more or less, and we can replicate their home market e-commerce store for them in China. So we do all of the inbound logistics, labeling, customs clearance, testing, product approval process, all of the store strategy operations, SKU selection, pricing, competitive map, all store operations and filling orders and customer contact work and returns and ratings and so forth, all of the social media work, and then financial settlement and IT integration. So you can sit any place basically in the world with a laptop and you can run a store on Tmall or JD or any place else in China. So it's very retail oriented, very e-commerce oriented China business solutions.
Now, your background, you have a depth of background. Tell us a little bit about that, your personal background in the China file.
Yeah, thanks. I spent most of my professional life in China issues, about half of it in government. I have to say about half of it in the private sector. But in government, I was in the White House and NSC and 2 tours of duty in the U.S. Commerce Department, undersecretary for George W. Bush. And I was also in the State Department, and I was U.S. Ambassador to Singapore. So worked a lot on trade negotiations, U.S.-China trade negotiations, a lot on market entry strategies, a lot on trade promotion and solving commercial issues. And I also worked in the private sector at Citibank and Bank of America, as well as Edelman Public Affairs. So a lot of financial solutions in China, too. So you put all that together, and we came up with a reasonably strong e-commerce set of solutions as well.
From your vantage point, long, vast, in-depth experience, is there any precedent for what we're witnessing in China today? Any lessons that can help us understand how the economy will flex and understand a little bit about maybe not just what's happening today, but how the economy overall we think might respond?
I'll say this, the broader your gaze, the broader your aperture, the more volatility you'll tend to encounter, and there can be shocks and disruptions. This will be toward the more extreme end of the spectrum. I think what we're going through now, because the size of the Chinese economy is so huge that when you and this coronavirus is going to be sort of, I think, long lasting. We'll get into the details, but we do see disruptions in international trade, and I'm thinking of two reasonably decent sized disruptions just in the last 12 months, Michael. One is Brexit, which is still unfolding, but that adds additional cost and complexity and uncertainty to retailers who are trying to crack the UK market or try to do something in Europe. And the other is the Australian bushfires, which again, it's a natural disaster, you could say, but it just adds extra cost and complexity and unknowns to it. This is going to be more severe economically than either of those two. So in that sense, it is somewhat unprecedented. But the idea of shocks to the international system in itself is not unprecedented. These things are going to happen.
Now, talk a little bit about the economic cycle in China. So it cycles around. There's a bit of a cycle around the New Year's when workers go home and enjoy time with their families, and then I'll come back, and it feels like it's another. Everyone gears up and really starts production. Am I characterizing that?
No,
fairly?
That's true. This is Chinese New Year's is the largest travel holiday in the world, where you'll have, because you have so many migrants in China, people who came from the villages and the farms to work in the big city. They're not highly paid folks. They might be waiters in a restaurant, meaning they can only afford to go back to the village, back to see mom and dad once a year. So this is the time you go do it, and you get on a train for an 11-hour train ride to bring gifts home to the relatives, to see everybody, and take a week or so off. So it shuts down the economy for a week. And then the Chinese government has said we're going to add one more week on top of that, just to sort of add an additional quarantine to this process. And then other cities, including Shanghai, have added extra days on top of that to say, listen, we really don't want people just showing up here because we do have this virus around, so we just soon shut everything down for another week. So it's going to be 2, 3, 4 weeks of significantly dampened economic activity in China because of a sort of an extended New Year's holiday.
I was watching those videos and witnessing the power of the centralized control model, when they built a hospital in X number of days and this ability to command tremendous resources. Does it give you confidence, or does it provide us a lens or a framework for how the economy in the country will, in the fullness of time, bounce back after such a shock?
Yeah, I do think they get their arms around it because they know it's damaging economically, it's damaging to people's lives, it's damaging reputationally. So they have an enormous incentive to get on top of this. You got to be careful how you phrase this. It is a reasonably contagious virus, but it's not all that lethal. It's not much more lethal than the annual flu that we get in North America. So but it's reasonably contagious. So once you can sort of get your arms around it, you've sort of won the battle. We might be, in fact, this week, next week, we might be sort of the worst of it, but it might take several weeks for, data tends to lag, and there's a fair amount of skepticism out there. So I think people will want to go. We'll stay in this firefighting mode, I think, for a good month or so before people will say, we think we've got our arms around it.
I've seen these such interesting pictures. I saw some TikTok videos and pictures. There's just massive piles of deliveries, at the doorsteps, literally, of apartment buildings, and people kind of milling through and getting their own thing. And with your expertise, we talk about, and we were talking off mic about different ways to respond in this new digital first economy that is China. And tell me a little bit about that. I mean, if this was happening in North America, retail stores and malls would be devastated. But in a country like China, where the infrastructure and the retail infrastructure is different, tell me a little bit about your thoughts.
Well, I think you're seeing 2 or 3 phenomenon. One or two we touched on. One is the New Year's holiday really shuts down a lot of activity. So that's just creeping back. And I think within 30 days, the holiday effect will be over. So but that really does. We see our sales drop 90% online sales during the holiday week. So that's one. 2 is the turmoil of the virus I wouldn't quite call it a panic, but people are in that kind of firefighting mode, and people are upset about it, and people can't travel, they can't go to work. So it's disruptive to everyday life. It's disruptive to the economy. And as we know, in times of turmoil, people will defer non-discretionary purchases. They're going to, if you were thinking of buying a new big screen TV or a new car or something, you tend to say, well, why don't we just push that back a few months? So it is going to dampen retail sales at the upper end of those retail sales. Of course, with your staples and food, you need to keep that going. So one is the holiday, two is the virus, three is just the overall macroeconomic effect, which we still don't know yet, but you'll see the economists and the bankers say, look, this is going to take 0.5% off of GDP. The GDP is going to go from 6 to 5.5 or thereabouts, right? It could go a little longer. So there's going to be just a little dampening effect on spending activity just because of the economic cost of this. But I'll tell you, then that's three bits of bad news. For our particular business, there is, we believe, a bit of good news that will bubble through the economy, which is a swing in relative terms to e-commerce, that people are more disinclined to go to malls and go to shops, and they're more inclined to say, let's just tilt a little more heavily on e-commerce and buy more from e-commerce. Look, China historically, meaning in the last 5 years, China has been more e-commerce oriented than North America or Europe or Japan and anything.
Right,
China,
right.
So a much higher percentage of consumer spend is e-commerce than we'd see in U.S. or Canada. But we think this just accelerates that trend. So you'll find in North America something like 10, 11, 12% of retail spend is e-commerce. But in China, it's 35%. So that's a heck of a base. And we think that number really gets a spike because of what's going on. Now, you make a very good point. There's that in certain cities like Wuhan, look, your delivery infrastructure is going to be disrupted. The whole city's under curfew. You can't travel. You can't get a cab. You can't get a bus. So there's going to be certain cities where it's just disrupted. You can't use e-commerce. But I think the longer term, if we look over 6 months, I think you're going to see a really nice bubble up of e-commerce spend.
Maybe a mix of pent-up demand and just, life returning back to normal. But in some ways, it will never be normal again. In other words, another couple of point lift on e-commerce because, wow, that's a good idea. I think I'll continue to do that.
Well, and as we know, whenever you introduce a new technology or new process, you have early adapters and you have laggards. So the person who says, look, I don't mind going to my corner store for shopping. I kind of enjoy it. I have my grocery routine twice a month, once a week. I go buy my greens. I go buy all, once that's disrupted, that pattern, you say, actually, I'm perfectly happy buying online. I'm perfectly happy having this person go, it's not such a bad deal. In fact, it's got some advantages. So the point is, once you taste that approach, you say, I'm not as excited about going to the corner shop anymore.
It's been a great overview, and really, I look forward to keeping in touch and for sure you staying safe in Singapore. But tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you, learn a little bit more about Export Now. I think they're going to be needing your services in the
I'd love to talk to folks. The best is probably LinkedIn, where it's Frank Lavin at LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter at Hello Frank Lavin on Twitter, and the company's name is Export Now, exportnow.com, one word, exportnow.com. But we love talking with brands. We love talking with retailers. We love talking about China strategy and market entry. That's our specialty. So please do drop us a line. Love to chat with you.
Frank, safe travels. Stay safe, and we look forward to reconnecting. And thanks so much for making time to chat with the Voice of Retail.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for calling.
Sarah, welcome to the Voice of Retail. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, and I am super excited to be on your show. You and I met, I think, just, what was it, last year?
Yeah.
And we've been talking about this for a while, and I love what you're doing, so thanks for having me on.
Well, listen, it's a treat to connect. I think we met at an SCI event, and to learn there's a fellow podcaster in this space. It's such a treat for me to have you on as a guest. And before we jump in, let's talk about that a little bit. Tell us a bit about your personal and professional journey and your media podcast and what you do and who you are.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I will try to keep it short. So I have been in the supply chain and logistics industry for over 2 decades. Majority of my career spent with a 3PL, so a third-party logistics company, doing freight forwarding, customs, warehousing, you name it, we did it. I spent a number of years in operations, then moved into sales, and then ended off that career as director of sales and marketing. And while I was director of sales sales and marketing. I did not like what was in marketing for supply chains. And I was listening to podcasts at the time. And so I thought, well, if Lewis Howes can do it, why can't I? And,
Right on.
That's a bit of a leap, but I pretty much, I think, said that to my team at the time. And so I grabbed a guy from my customs department and I thought, what's sort of a funny name that we could call it? And we called it Two Babes Talk Supply Chain. And it got us some airtime and people kind of resonated with it. And we had a great fun with it for the first year or so. And then he went on to better things, and I decided to take it over. And I started the Woman in Supply Chain series in Jan 2018, but they didn't really resonate with the name anymore. So in April 2018, I rebranded it within a week to Let's Talk Supply Chain. And it was the craziest week of my life. I don't suggest people to jump in like that because it's a lot of work, but it's been incredible over the last 18 months to 2 years. We've expanded the Woman in Supply Chain to a blog. We've expanded onto YouTube, the SC Supply Chain TV. The podcast is going really well, really strong. That's called Let's Talk Supply Chain. And doing all sorts of things, going to a lot of conferences, doing podcast booths, live streaming, you name it. I'm working with a lot of great companies in the supply chain space to get their brand story out and messaging out. And it's just been incredible.
Give us a sense of how important China is from a trade retail perspective, but lay out what that supply chain looks like. How do goods flow from China to Canada?
Well, so maybe we start with what supply chain is. So supply chain, it starts with sourcing of product. It goes into the procurement or the buying of product or raw materials. Then it goes into the logistics side, which is the transportation of the goods. That can be done by truck. It can be done by air, by ocean. When we're talking about China, we're looking at moving goods by air freight or ocean freight. And then once it gets here, then we're into distribution and warehousing. So it goes into a warehouse, into inventory. And then when you decide to purchase something online or in store, it comes out of that inventory and either goes direct to store or direct to consumer. And so that's a little bit of a high level of what the supply chain looks like. And so just from some numbers, I pulled up a Forbes article and it said in 2000 there was an 800% increase in what we were doing from 2003 to 2019.
So when we think about China, we hear phrases like on the water, and as you mentioned, there's really two ways. It's really it's funny, we think of China as, for those of us who's front of mind, it's really very far away. It's on the other side of the world. And so really there's two ways to get things, air and by sea. And when we talk about on the water, what does that mean in terms of real term, in terms of how long that takes, like from start to finish? Not even talking about the other elements of the supply chain, but just saying, I need a widget manufactured and now I need it into Canada. Give us a sense of how long that, or what that journey looks like.
Well, it depends what part you start that journey, right? So if you're talking about just ordering that raw material or that product from your supplier, there's obviously the time it takes to make the product, right? Once the product is made, it's ready to go. Then depending on your Incoterms, you will either pick it up from your shipper or your shipper will deliver it into either the port or the warehouse to be put with other products. It depends if you're shipping your own container or if you're shipping your products along with a bunch of other products in a container. And then once it gets into the container, then it's been put on a vessel, and the vessel is bringing that container across to usually Vancouver or Prince Rupert. So when they say on the water, it's really that part of the transit of where the container is on the vessel, and it's making its way over from China to Vancouver. And then once it gets to Vancouver, then it's offloaded, put onto rail, and it's railed to Toronto if that's the final destination.
So do you have a sense, and I know it's kind of a very broad question, how long does it take to get the average product, once it's made, across the water and into the port in Vancouver? Like how long is that element of the supply chain? Weeks, months? Give us a sense of what that looks like.
Port to port, I think Shanghai to Vancouver was maybe 14 days. I think 14 to 21 days. That's not pickup from your shipper, because even once it's picked up from your shipper, it needs to be taken to a yard and it has to wait to get on the vessel. And that's at least 7 to 10 days. And then if your product is coming to Toronto from Vancouver, you've got another 7 to 10 days on the back end.
What are you hearing from supply chain professionals in terms of dealing with what's going on in China? It's obviously, early days, so really kind of early observation and thoughts, but I'm curious as to what you're hearing about, the supply chain professionals thinking. They're used to thinking through as a community gnarly issues and moving things around and shocks and dealing with workarounds and figuring out great solutions. But what are you hearing about what's going on now in China with the coronavirus and manufacturing and shipping and transportation closures?
Well, there's been a lot, right? I don't know about you, but I've heard about a lot of different things. Apple closing down stores in that region. So not only does that affect the inventory, because the inventory is piling up because they're not selling it because the stores aren't open, right? And then you've got the container lines that right now I was reading on Splash247.com about how it looks like the virus is causing 350,000 TEUs per week not getting on vessels.
What's that? An acronym? TEU? What's that?
So a TEU is the equivalent to a 20-foot container.
So say that again. How many are not getting on containers?
350,000, which means that they're losing $350 million.
At some point, the factories will come back online, but there'll be a huge log jam. Is there going to be like a choke point, so to speak, or a real tight place where at the dockside, there's going to be suddenly a big influx of product that needs to get across the water? Is that a risk as well?
I think it is a little bit of a risk, but what you've got to realize too is that the coronavirus came in just after Chinese New Year. Mm-hmm. So a lot of companies in North America had already done their planning based around Chinese New Year anyways. And so they would either have gotten product shipped before Chinese New Year, or they made sure that they had the inventory on hand that they would need to sustain themselves through Chinese New Year. Because from a supply chain perspective, Chinese New Year is about a month.
Well, okay.
It's only a couple of days in China, but the factories are closed for at least a month. And it takes about 2 weeks to a month on the front end and the back end for everything to get back into the swing of things.
In the normal course of action. So I guess and I've heard from retailers that they're not concerned now. Many aren't even concerned for the spring, but they're starting to be concerned about how they think about even longer past that, right into the fall. Is so that kind of length of time and duration. So some of this is expected. It happens every year. The Chinese New Year kind of closes factories down. So that's already taken into account. Does it come then now to how long those factories stay closed and how long transportation really stays closed to shipping goods across the water?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to see. I mean, like you said, some of the factories are coming back slowly. So things are starting to get back into production. But and the conversations that I've been trying to have around the coronavirus, and not just for enterprise companies, but also small to medium-sized companies is, how do this isn't the first time, it's not the last time. How are we going to be, it's more present or prevalent these days because of the increase of how much trade we do with China. And since it's not going to be the last time, how do we be proactive instead of reactive? I mean, this time we had to be reactive because obviously since SARS in 2003, our trade with China has risen exponentially. But from here on out, this is, we've really got to take a look at our businesses and our supply chains and figure out what we're going to do or be proactive for next time. And, I say in my show all the time, collaboration is the future of business. And I think collaboration's got to be part of that proactive strategy.
is this the purview of the big retailers? Can small, mid-sized retailers figure their way around and have these supply chain solutions that you've talked about, that being the collaboration and the being nimble?
Yeah, I think that obviously agility is going to play a big role in that, but also the new technologies that are available for businesses and supply chain. I think, data is huge when it comes to being proactive rather than reactive. But we just need to, when we're doing the data mining and we're looking at the data mining that we need, we just need to make sure that we're accumulating and looking at the data that's going to help us in a situation like this.
If people want to learn more about you or find your podcast, visit your website, how do they get in touch with you?
So there's a couple ways to do that. My website is letstalksupplychain.com. You'll find the blog, the podcast, and the YouTube channel. And then over on LinkedIn, I am really, really, really big on LinkedIn and would love to connect with everybody. So find me under Sarah Barnes Humphrey, or you can go and follow the Let's Talk Supply Chain LinkedIn page as well. We're almost at, I think, 17,000 followers, and we start some really, really great conversations around supply chain and different things like that.
Well, Sarah, thanks so much for making time to speak with me here on The Voice of Retail. It was a real treat to speak to another podcaster, and you've done such a great job in building out what I think is a fantastic service for the supply chain industry. So congratulations, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And hopefully, knock on wood, this coronavirus doesn't impact everybody too much.
Audrey, welcome to The Voice of Retail. How are you doing today?
Great, thank you.
Well, thanks for joining me. We want to talk about the situation in China and again, leverage your expertise and insight into helping retailers start to get their arms around this situation in the short, medium, and long term. But first of all, before we dive into that, tell us a bit about yourself, your personal, professional journey, and about Orchard Custom Beauty and what you do there.
So I've been with Orchard. This is my 15th year. I started as a summer student. I started, right at the getting coffee and packing up samples level, and kind of slowly worked my way around and into logistics, customs compliance, and overall operations and supply chain. Orchard Custom Beauty we're a private label beauty house. We focus on cosmetics, beauty and bath accessories, and we do quite a few cosmetic bags and kind of tote and handbags.
I see from the site you got a great roster of retail clients, not just here in Canada, but also North American wide. So fantastic sense of the market.
Yeah, we're actually quite a global company. We do our manufacturing, some in North America, quite a bit overseas, into Europe, Czech Republic and Germany, Italy. We do some in Australia, through South Asia, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea. And then here in North America, we have a couple of great fillers in Canada and the US. And then our customers are kind of around the same places. We've got a lot of customers, a few big retailers in the US, here in Canada, in Germany, France, UK, and then also in Australia and South Asia. So it keeps us.
Wow, you're busy. Yeah. Talk about a global company. So like I said, we're trying to get our arms around this COVID-19, the coronavirus, and how it's going to, specifically, there's a lot of impacts in all kinds of different ways. But I'm really trying to get my arms around, as I said, the supply chain implications. And first, tell us, how important is China to the industry in general, and what that looks like, scale and scope, the movement of product?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, for us, I think for most people, it's absolutely massive. When the average consumer looks at the origin of their product, I mean, the bulk of products are made in and around China. And if not your product, maybe not the finished good, but most of the materials are coming from China. So on the cosmetic side, we're looking at delays in sort of our plastic and plastic manufacturing and paperboard manufacturing. But I think the biggest hit for us is that even if we were to shift supply chain or shift our manufacturing to, maybe somewhere like Vietnam, Cambodia, into Bangladesh, even back into North America, if you go and look at the actual source of where your fabrics are being woven and made and produced, they're all coming from China. So we can only kind of go for so long before we're short on materials and fabrics, and our source to get them it is China. So for most of the industry, this is a massive implication.
Yeah, it's a great point because I talked to many retailers and they said, listen, the whole thing isn't made in China. Maybe they're sourcing, as you said, fabrics that they're shipping to Vietnam to be finally finished, or as you said in your case, it's not the product itself, but it's the containers, it's the boxes, all these different, there's such a global supply chain that you talked about. And there's just different pieces coming from different places. So, look, it's early days. We're not quite sure what the impact is going to be to supply chains, but we can start to make educated guesses on what we know today. So what are you hearing and thinking about the situation from your perspective in terms of, we already talked about its scope. What about its scale and how what you're hearing about reaction and movement of goods?
Well, at this point, we're still seeing the majority of people are at home, and it doesn't matter what province they're in or how close they are to kind of what's kind of considered that hot zone. So we're now, Chinese New Year started. Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year was on Jan 25th. It usually ramps up about a week to 10 days before that. So we're almost pushing 6 weeks of just no production, no manufacturing, no work. And I think what people were sort of hoping, was this would kind of flare up and then flare back down and, kind of resolve itself. And, from some of the new numbers we're seeing today and some of the new infections, it just doesn't seem to be slowing down, or able to kind of, neatly resolve itself as I think we would hope. And what that means is, if you have to sort of assess your supply chain from, whatever stage you're at. So if I had things that were in production that are finished and just haven't been handed over to be shipped, okay, what can I plan for to get those shipped? And the biggest issue there is there's no one to drive any trucks. So the vessels can come into port. There are planes sitting on the tarmac. There is no one to drive a truck. And I got an inside tip the other day that someone's like, I've got a truck driver. I've got this guy and he's 3 times the price of what he was, 5 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So, which there's some businesses who are like, I'm fine with 3 times the price as long as it's moving.
Right.
So you gotta make that call. Then there's people who the goods are sort of somewhat finished. They just need to we have a few projects like that. We're just, we just need the factory to go back and kind of pack it up and have the inspection and ship it out. But, the scale of people going back isn't there. And then there's, the just about to start production level and where that's going to be. If, say your manufacturer can go back, but your fabric supplier or your piece or parts supplier isn't back or your printer isn't back. Yeah. And then I think the overarching, we, obviously we're not making stuff and it goes into production tomorrow. We are looking months out. So with our customers, we're working on projects for, 2021. But there's no sample makers. So how do you get the commitment to a project when you can't really have your normal process of okay, here's the picture of it. Here's the material you want. And the next stage is usually sampling. And that sampling is usually hand done, especially if you're working in China. So there's no one to hand make your samples. There's no way to show your samples. So we're all kind of, not only are we starting to be stalled on, okay, my stuff was ready to go and now it's not moving. Okay, fine. But now it's like, how are we going to actually, what products are we going to have in the stores for October 2020? What are we going to have in January 2021? Because that's usually how, or even further, that's how far we plan.
Well, you're introducing such a broader landscape, so to speak, to the discussion. So thank you again for joining me. I mean, my first guest, Frank Lavin, talked about this huge movement of people. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest movement of people. And this happens every year, right? So
that's annual. Yeah.
So that's an annual thing. And as a supply chain expert, that there's a ramp up and there's a period and there's 10 days when really things don't happen. But that happens every year. You account for that. It's this you talked about 6 weeks with nothing happening. That's the issue, right? Is that, you've planned and already have plans, taken into account this cycle, but now the cycle is extended and we're just not quite sure when everyone's going to get back to work. I mean, that's at what point, I'm trying to get a sense of, at what point, is it a couple of weeks out, or is it already starting to affect, it sounds like it's already starting to affect some very long-term planning today. But what impresses me always about China is their ability, they built a hospital in, 6 days or something.
Oh my gosh.
Like they can catch up really quick because of they're so good at marshaling resources. What's your level of confidence that these things can catch up, but and overcome these kind of bottlenecks or choke points in the process?
I mean, I have confidence, but I do think the ramp up, it really is, once everything gets back to go, at this point, there's a bit of backlog, right? So it's at what stage or what level is the backlog?
Right.
How long is it going to take us to clear kind of the backlog and at the same time move forward on these kind of future projects? Because in retail, like I say, I mean, you're working on next season, you're working on 2 seasons out, and you can kind of slow that down because you're like, well, realistically, I don't need to place an order for Mother's Day 2021 now.
Right.
But I mean, I have to be ready to place that order by July, September.
So I guess from your client's perspective, the retailer's perspective, they need to be ready in if all goes better, to make faster decisions.
Yes.
In some ways, right?
I think marshaling the resources overseas, I mean, for sure, you have, most people, like, they're going to come back to work and they're just going to put their heads down and get stuff done. I think what's going to have to be adapted from our customers' perspective, or from sort of the global interaction of our customers, is that, we used to have 4 months or 6 months to plan for holiday 2021, or even looking at holiday 2020. Typically, we're starting to get orders between now and June. But if you're waiting till June to place your order this year, it is probably not going to happen. So you're right, tightening up that decision process on this side for what you've decided to order. We're really going to have to buckle down and figure that out.
It's a nice segue to my last question is, we've been talking about this situation on the ground in China and movement of product. Now, we all know it has to get here and has to be received somewhere.
Yes.
And that often is the Vancouver ports or Montreal. What's your assessment of their ability to handle, this quiet period? I guess will be a bit of a quiet period these days with the CN rail blockages. But, if it's not raining, it's pouring for you guys in the supply chain.
Vancouver? Oh my gosh, yeah. It's never one thing. So, it's funny because people are like, oh, it's never this crazy. And you're like,
it's always this crazy.
Really? There's either their own kind of labor union work issues that are happening. There's either
last year
weather, there's, so I think that, the best thing, that you can do is just try to be, for us, it's being open and honest with their customers on what's going on and where their stuff is. Offering the options that you may have available. I'm starting to see so many air quotes. People think air is going to solve their problem, but Air Canada isn't even back on their routes yet.
Right.
And who's to say if on March 1st they're actually going to go back? That's what's keeping me up at night.
No, interesting.
You asked earlier, what's keeping you up at night? Air Canada not going back on March 1st. That's what keeps me up at night.
Well, it actually talking to you, and you'll be my third interview. It gives me great confidence because I have a lot of confidence that, for many people, these kind of shocks are like, oh my God, what are we going to do? But for supply chain professionals, you deal with them almost on a daily basis. You're a very nimble, go with the flow and figure out plan A through, X, Z, or Y. So you've actually given me some confidence that, your profession can help us manage through, but we're all going to learn together. Listen, it's early days. Thank you so much for joining me. And as this thing continues, I might do a follow-up podcast, just to kind of assess where we are in the weeks to come. So hopefully you might be able to join me back on. Yeah. If anyone wants to learn more about you or get in touch with you, how do they do that? Oh,
I'm a bit of a Twitter aficionado. So I'm at Trey Audrey on Twitter, TRES Audrey. And then, I'm on LinkedIn too, trying to be the professional and interact with quite a big group of supply chainers on LinkedIn.
Well, that's perfect. Well, listen, thanks again for giving me and sharing your insights with me and the listeners, and it was a real treat to have you on the Voice of Retail. And I wish you and everyone in the weeks ahead success and good luck in managing through this one.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael.
Well, thanks to Frank, Sarah, and Audrey for being my guests on this special episode. Well, now let's hit the highlights of the retail news in Canada and around the world for this with our retail this week for the week of February 17th, 2020. So this episode obviously was dedicated to the coronavirus issues and supply chain. But of course, we have another supply chain issue, as Audrey and I chatted about briefly, and that's the CN, the rail blockades. And a bunch of articles on that. This one from Truck News, the blockades could lead to a spike in demand for trucking. I don't know if it's just anecdotal or if it's I'm just noticing it more, but certainly I'm seeing and experiencing more freight trucks on the road. But of course, it's Carl Littler says from RCC, you just cannot replace that kind of volume and put it on the roads. It's just the capacity just does not exist. So there's some good statements on Retail Council's site about and updates around what's going on in this issue, and hopefully this one gets resolved quickly because it's going to start affecting the movement of goods and costs real soon. Away Luggage brand to enter Canada with first standalone store. This is from Craig Patterson's Retail Insider. So Away Luggage, very hot product, a little bit of controversy in the organizational structure perspective. You've been following the news with the CEO kind of resigning and then saying she didn't resign and coming back, and a bit of choppy waters there for them. But Away launching here in Yorkdale Shopping Centre. A couple of articles I included in retail this week, just talking about this whole coronavirus and supply chain issue. This article from CBC: dress shops, bridal stores experience delays from Chinese suppliers. It says, talked about in this article, for wedding dress would take 6 months to arrive. Now brides are going to have to wait 8, even a year, even though the gowns are designed in North America. Many of them are actually then manufactured or made in China. Furniture retailer Pier 1 imports closing all Canadian stores filing for bankruptcy protection. It's been a long time coming. So this from the Globe and Mail, and you got a quote here from the CEO talking about provide Tier 1 with additional time and financial flexibility. So as we know, as you go into bankruptcy, it gives you a chance, gives these companies a chance, a bit of negotiating power for sure with their landlords. Maybe they'll come out a smaller company. Smaller, of course, is Steve Dennis often says, smaller isn't better. Better is better. So we wish our friends at Pier 1 all the best. Cannabis extract prices vary wildly between provincially run stores. This is kind of from CBC, kind of a deeper dive into pricing strategies of 2.0. And of course, the retailers are really, pulling their product from, in many cases, provincially owned, certainly in Ontario, provincially owned distributors, right? So they don't have a choice from which distributor, and the prices are set. So this article tracks some tremendous variability in the price of the same goods from province to province. And the net conclusion, some of the folks quoted there from Deloitte, for example, are doing some work. It's early days. This will sort itself out. So we'll be keeping an eye on that one. What else? Lots of interesting things happening in video. There's a great interview with Walmart CEO on Q4 earnings, and he talks a lot about, of course, always insightful. One of the things Walmart, like Target a couple of weeks ago, talked about is the weakness in the toy category overall. And he talks about briefly, he being the Walmart CEO, talks about, we're just starting to get our understanding of what, since it's the theme of the episode, what the coronavirus is going to do. Too early to say is his assessment, but they're keeping a close eye on that. As well, RCC's Marc Fortin is in the news in the video here, the Montreal's recycling crisis. So watch that video because there's a lot going on in the recycling. As I said, this is going to be a big year talking about sustainability. And if you put all that into a basket, recycling is at the doorstep, a major issue that retailers are having to deal with in terms of who owns, who pays. It's very complex. Don't want to get into it here. But anyway, it's a great video to watch. So do get a chance. If you do get a chance, watch that video. From retailer on the world, Bed Bath & Beyond to invest $1 billion that's billion with a B, in buybacks and store upgrades in a bid to turn around the business. So Bed Bath & Beyond's been in the news for past a number of months. I mean, the last time the new CEO came in and basically cleaned house and brought in a whole new team. They just, the guy who came in, Triton, who was a chief merchant at Target, and now he's got a plan to rejuvenate Bed Bath & Beyond, so we wish him luck. IKEA becomes the first retailer to let customers pay using time. So this is a quirky one in some ways. Of course, IKEA being so forward thinking. It's interesting, this article from Forbes, the prior one, by the way, is CNBC. It's interesting to read about what they're doing, and the more time it takes to get to the store in Dubai, you can somehow pay and pay as a currency. So, it's a promotional fun, but maybe there's something to it. So we'll keep a close eye on that one. From CNBC, and actually last week there's a lot of articles from the Globe and Mail. This week, lots from CNBC. Apparel sales had their worst month in 10 years in the U.S., and here's why. So, Neil Saunders there from a great analyst talking about why apparel sales are soft in the U.S., and there's a whole bunch of things, and it quotes from everything from not prioritizing products, unfavorable ranges, boredom with buying, unfavorable weather, certainly not the result of economic malaise or lack of spending power. So we may see that category move around a bit, or the spending move around a bit. Another article here from Forbes is the world's factory shuts down, fashion retailers are left counting the cost. Again, back to coronavirus, coronavirus, I should say, the Chinese consumer accounts for 38% of the global fashion industry consumption, and much of that in the luxury sector. So again, more information to keep an eye on. We mentioned this one last week, and it has come to pass. Victoria's Secret has been sold to Sycamore Partners, private equity. They also own Staples, just to name one of many. And they're going to split that off. 55% stake sold to Sycamore for $525 million, so I guess valuing it about $1 billion. You'd think they'd be worth a bit more for Victoria's Secret, but not today. Wexner, who's been in the news for all the wrong reasons, becomes chairman emeritus of L Brands. So still having trouble in his 80s detaching himself from the business. We'll see if that comes to haunt them. What else? Independent retailer Stokes is streamlining its head office operations, so they're thinning out the ranks and trying to resize and adjust to, this from CTV News, trying to resize and adjust their place in retail. Wish them luck. Small business owners from CNBC, again, I put this one, the coronavirus means 10 times for small business owners who import products. This is an interesting article because, and I put it in not to be redundant, but I put it in because it talks about all the people who sell product on the Amazon marketplaces, and Amazon marketplaces punishes you pretty quickly, and when you're out of stock, you lose your place, you lose your ranking, and so a lot of these small businesses who are selling on Amazon are going to be in a bit of trouble. I guess collectively they're all going to be in trouble, so maybe that'll all smooth things out. That from CNBC. What else? From Lethbridge Herald, police dealing with youth gangs targeting cell phone retailers. We've talked about this in the episode a couple of times. Very violent gangs rush in, steal and steal phones, and then rush out, in this case, 25,000 worth of phones. So we're keeping a close, we being Retail Council of Canada, keeping a close eye on that one, working with police services across the country. Return of the mall, our great article from Canadian Retailer. What else? We've got food services booming. So Canadian Grocer, article published with Dalhousie University, Angus Reid, talks about, of course, with and through Professor Sylvain Charlebois, who's been a guest a couple episodes. They did a survey of 1,500 Canadians, 1,550 Canadians to be precise. 2/3, 64%, believe the prices are too high, and this is of food package delivery, and the temperature of the food delivered was an issue for 45% of the respondents, the packaging 32%. So worth reading through in Canadian Grocery. This obviously isn't like groceries delivered to the door, but also a whole range of different things, foods delivered to the door. So check that out. What else? Great article in the New York Times. Never mind the internet. Here's what's killing malls. And they just throw out some numbers, which are interesting. Despite a super strong economy, retailers closed 9,000 stores in 2019, more than 2018. which itself was a record about 2017. This year, so far, we're at 1,200 stores closing, and that includes 125 Macy's stores. So anyway, good article to read, give you a good overview of all the various issues, not just what's happening, but what's happening in modern retail. Of course, there is no retail apocalypse, but the transformation is real. Well, that's a wrap on this edition of The Voice of Retail. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple, iTunes, or your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review, and be sure to recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail industry. I'm Michael LeBlanc, founder and president of M.E. LeBlanc Company, Inc. You can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co or, of course, on LinkedIn. Until next time, have a great week.